So we are definitely going to talk about understanding the importance of the 2020 census, really gaining some knowledge about it, and then we're going to take some time at the end to practice really how you can educate your families about the importance of everyone being counted. So one piece that I do want to note before we get started is really on if any of your sites do have AmeriCorps members talking about what they are allowed to do in terms of census outreach and what they are not allowed to do. So the first piece is that AmeriCorps members are not allowed to claim service hours while engaging in census outreach. And so I think this is an important piece. Certainly they can receive training and information about the census that's outside of their service hours. And if they chose to on their own, they could certainly decide to take the time to do some census outreach, but they can't count service hours for any of that time spent. We do have some AmeriCorps sites that will be doing like group meetings or group connections. And within those group meetings or group connections, it's likely that a person that is not fully funded through AmeriCorps could be leading that group and share the census information. And AmeriCorps members could act more in a supportive role for that group connection for the day, helping with food, things like that on the side. But certainly if any questions come up about AmeriCorps members participating, absolutely check in with Jackie Cordova and she'd be happy to kind of troubleshoot that with you. So we are going to watch a video together about getting an accurate census count. And I am going to work on sharing this video with you as well as muting my phone so that hopefully we won't have any major feedback. So let me just make sure here.
Ever since I was little, I've known it's important to count the right number. Like the number of scoops I got in my ice cream cone. Hey, I asked for 5. Or the number of coins in my piggy bank. I remember this one time in class. Our teacher, Mr. Knorr, came in with a surprise for us. It was his birthday, so he brought cupcakes for everyone. But there was a problem. He had 15 cupcakes, and there were 20 of us in class. Mr. Knorr should have counted more carefully when he was taking attendance. Counting is also really important for the U.S. Census Bureau. In the spring of 2020, it will count every person who lives in the United States. They call this count the 2020 census. It's just like when your teacher takes attendance in class, except it's for the whole country. For the 2020 census, the Census Bureau needs every person to tell the country they are here, in every home, in every neighborhood, in every state, on every U.S. island territory. Everywhere! Tell the adults in your home to make sure they count everyone who lives with you. That includes grandparents, uncles and aunts, cousins, even people who aren't related to you who live with you. Make sure they count every kid, even babies who are 1 day old. Make sure they count you too, but not the cat. It's really important to count everyone. Why? Because a correct count for the 2020 census helps the government figure out what your community needs. That can mean more schools, teachers, classroom computers, or after-school activities and programs. It can also mean more help for things like parks and playgrounds, housing, roads, hospitals, and so much more. The 2020 census starts in the spring, and April 1st is Census Day. Ask a grown-up in your home to circle April 1st on the calendar as a reminder to complete the census. Help us make sure we get the right count. Then we can all celebrate! Tell all of the adults in your home to make sure you're counted in the 2020 census. Learn more at 2020census.gov.
So I think that video is a kind of great child-focused way of talking about the census, and we're just going to walk through briefly really about what the census is and really talking through why it is so important for Colorado and that we get an accurate count. So the census is a count of every person living in the U.S., and this happens every 10 years. The census is required by our Constitution, and that's the reason why we do this. This year will be the first year for the census that it's going to be conducted in a variety of ways, including for the first time online. In addition to that, there will be options for people to participate by phone, through the mail, and then also in person. I think one thing that's really important for families to know is that really it isn't the U.S. As the only country that does a census like this. There are many other countries that do similar types of counts. For instance, Mexico, Brazil, India are countries that all do a similar type of count to the U.S. And Census Day is April 1st of 2020 this year. That doesn't mean that's the only day that the census happens, but they kind of pick a day, and that is the day this year. So in talking about why the census is important, absolutely this is a critical thing, certainly for kids and for families in Colorado. In 1 year, Colorado received about $2 billion in federal funding for kids programs. When we think about the types of federal funding that are kind of part of that, things like Medicaid, WIC, SNAP, TANF, if anybody is a McV recipient or receives home visiting dollars from the federal government, Colorado got about $8.1 million of that resource to do home visiting programming. All of those are based on how many people they've attributed to living in Colorado. The government does this because they feel that this is one of the best ways to figure out how to equitably distribute resources. And certainly we know that Colorado's population has increased substantially in the past 10 years. And so certainly for Colorado, it's really important for us to figure out how much that population has increased, and then hopefully to be given more of a share of federal resources based on that increase in population. Another thing that the census will do is allocate how many representatives Colorado will have for the House of Representatives. We now have 7. It's certainly expected that Colorado is likely to pick up an extra seat and have an additional congressperson. So we will see, but certainly if we don't get our count up to more accurately reflect what is the true population here, that wouldn't happen. I think another really important thing to note too is that young children are really the most undercounted group in the census. And this is due to a variety of reasons that we'll talk more about, but I think the important piece is knowing the ramifications for that, because if we don't count a 2-year-old in this census, really allocating resources for their preschool years, into their elementary years, into starting middle school, they will not be considered for all of that planning. And so certainly we know that the consequences of that could last for their entire childhood. So it's extremely important that we get them counted. So in talking a little bit more about that drastic undercount of young children, the last census missed 1 million young children. And I think folks that do this work have really been very thoughtful in figuring out why that is the case. And I think The reality is that young children are more likely to live in complex households. So certainly in multi-generational households with extended family, or living in a house that has two or more families. Certainly we have kids that split time between parents or other family members, and so that can make it more complicated to figure out where to count them. And it's also possible that they could be living in a home where the person completing that census form for that address or household is not their parent, and certainly can decrease the likelihood that they're going to be counted. So in terms of thinking about important messages that we are kind of working on sharing with our communities, I think there's three primary messages that we're, looking at doing. The first one is that doing the census is important. Certainly it's important so that Colorado and local communities can have their fair share of resources. But it's also important that it is required by law. Not that I've ever seen, punitive action taken against people for not responding to the census, but it is something that we are supposed to do. I think beyond that, I think the Census Bureau is trying to do their best to figure out a way to make the census as easy as possible. Certainly, it can be done online now, which for some people is easier. For others, clearly that's going to be a barrier, and we can talk more about that. But then there is also the option of doing it on the phone. It is pretty brief. I think if you take the actual census in, just for yourself, most people can kind of fill out those 9 questions for themselves in 1 to 2 minutes. Certainly that becomes much more complex if you've got, 8 to 10 people living in your house. It's going to make it a lot harder. But I think they've tried to shorten it the best that they can, and trying to make it as easy as possible. And then we're absolutely going to talk a lot about the safety of the census, but confidentiality of personal information is protected by major penalties to any violators. And so certainly I think that is something that we want to share with our communities that are worried about the safety of the census. So in terms of how you'll be invited to respond, the majority of families in the state and the country will receive an invitation in the mail to respond to the census, and that's going to come out in mid-March. That's going to be a letter basically saying, hey, it's census time. Please go on to this online website or call this phone number, and that's where you can fill out your census. In addition to that, about 5% of households that don't get their mail at home, so folks that have P.O. boxes, will get that same type of letter, but it's going to come from an actual census taker person. So for instance, in Clear Creek County in Colorado, they have a ton of P.O. boxes, and so there are going to be people driving out to all of these homes, and initially kind of just leaving on their doorstep a similar type of invitation to participate. People that have P.O. boxes, like a census invitation is not going to go to their P.O. box. So you should be aware of that. It's going to be associated with the address or the home. In addition to that, certainly the census would love it if most people responded online. I think they've seen that as a more cost-effective way to do this, and that is their hope. But there's also going to be the option for a phone response, which I think for a lot of more complex cases and families may end up being the best option for people to respond. The phone option for the census, there will be individuals that speak 14 different languages that will be able to help people around the country complete the census through the phone. In addition to that, the census has created 59 non-English language guides where it's not necessarily that the census is in that language, but you, like the actual form, but you would be able to match like the English form response with what that means in one of those 59 languages. So hopefully that all makes sense. Okay. So this is important for folks to kind of understand, but this is the timeline for how the census is going to work. So between about March 12th to March 20th, those initial letters or invitations are going to start to arrive in people's mailboxes. It's not all going to arrive on the same day, primarily because U.S. Postal Service cannot handle that, and so they're staggering mailings, and they'll, in an attempt not to overwhelm kind of the mail system. But people should expect that between around kind of mid-March time, we will start receiving our census invitations in the mail. After that, if folks have not yet gone online or called and responded to the census, in that kind of end of March to beginning of April time period, people are going to first get a reminder letter saying, hey, you haven't responded to the census yet, here's how you do it. And then after that, they're going to get a reminder postcard. So there's going to be quite a few attempts, to get in touch with people. Again, April 1st is Census Day, but clearly people can respond anytime between this mid-March and also July time period. Then, if folks still have not responded by April 8th through the 16th, they're going to receive a reminder letter and also a paper questionnaire. So this is really the first time for folks that remember filling out past census questionnaires. This is the first time that people are going to see an actual paper form, is if they have not responded through all of these attempts. And then we'll get a paper questionnaire. And then final reminders are going to be going out at the end of April. So really, the time for families to respond is kind of that mid-March through the end of April period. And then starting in May is when census workers will start to go out to any addresses or any houses that have not yet responded to the census. And they will be knocking on doors and encouraging the household to respond to the census there in person with them. So I think certainly one thing that may be helpful for some families to know and really understand is they certainly may not respond kind of during this period, but if they really don't want somebody to come to their door, it's going to help kind of reduce those odds of an in-person visit if they do respond by April 30th. So I will be sending you guys later today in kind of a zipped file, because there's a lot of documents that I'm going to send to you, but really information about, I will send you a copy of the actual census questions in the census form. Ultimately, what that form asks are 9 questions, and then those questions are repeated for every person in that household. The questions are the number of people living at that address, if that place is owned or rented, and then they're going to ask about the name, the age, the sex of all the people in that household, their relationship to the person completing the form. They will have a question about Hispanic origin, and then one following about race. And then in addition to that, there is a space for a phone number. And in talking with folks from the census, the purpose of that phone number is that, so if the census has a question about a form that was filled out, they could use that phone number to contact people rather than going door to door. And so that's really the purpose of that phone number. This question gets asked a lot, but I think there's questions on what happens if you leave something blank. Certainly, I think there'll be an option to leave an item blank, but I do think that's going to increase the likelihood that somebody is either going to call or come to somebody's door to try and get that information. So I think families should just be aware of that. I think another piece to really be clear about is we know what the questions are. That also means that we absolutely know what the questions are not. And I think there have been a lot of concerns about fraud and about people trying to take advantage of the census and get people to share things that they shouldn't be sharing. And so census workers will absolutely never ask for a Social Security number, a bank card number, what somebody's political party affiliation is, and they absolutely will not charge anyone to complete the census. I think already there's been an issue of people falsely thinking that they had to pay money to complete the census and that they were required to do this, and people that did follow through with that. So I think in terms of protecting families, I think that's really important information for them to know. In addition to that, we absolutely know that there is no citizenship question on the census. In June of 2019, the Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration could not include a citizenship question on the 2020 census, and so it's absolutely not on there. I think it's important to note, though, that prior to that date, there were practice or test census forms that were sent out to kind of, figure out and work out the kinks of the census process. And because those went out before that ruling was made, there were forms that did have that question on it. And so I think for anybody who actually did complete that form or had seen that form, clearly they may believe that it's still on there. I think regardless, there's definitely a lot of misinformation out in many communities about the question, but we can definitely reassure families that citizenship question is not on the form, and we will have copies that I'm sharing with you of the actual census form, which can be shared with families, and show them, like, these are the actual questions. Like, we know what's on there. These are the questions, and it's not that. So we absolutely know, though, that this has caused fear for many families and is super concerning. So it is something that we go into this work absolutely knowing. I want to talk, too, about the confidentiality and the safety of the census. So I think one important thing about knowing about what people share and provide on the census is that the way that information is used is it's compiled in a group format. So lots and lots of people are compiled together, and it can only be used to produce statistics. And that is really the purpose and the intent of that data. I think another really important piece around all of this is that all census staff, so anybody that works for the Census Bureau, takes a lifetime, so their entire life, an oath to protect the personal information that they see. And there are very serious penalties for any census workers that violate that in any way. So fines of up to $250,000 or up to 5 years in prison. And so it's absolutely something that is taken very seriously. I think another piece that's important for families to know is that it is in law, but by law, your responses can't be used against you. They can't be shared with, for instance, like a landlord who may see a census worker and be like, hey, I think there's, more people living in that apartment than are on that lease. Can you check on that for me? They absolutely could not do that. Similarly, information can't be shared with ICE. It can't be shared with other government departments, the FBI, the executive branch. Really, census information by law is contained within the Census Bureau. And so that is absolutely important information to have. I think that regardless of all of this, I think it's really still hard to reassure families, especially during this time, that any information they share with the government is safe. And so it's certainly one of the reasons why we're doing work in this way is that we absolutely know that home visitors are trusted messengers for families across the state. And we hope that, in discussions with somebody that they trust, they'll be able to kind of hear some of that safety information and feel a bit more comfortable with it. So I think that, that's clearly why we have asked for your support and your help in doing this work, because it's about that relationship that hopefully families are going to feel a bit more comfortable. And they're absolutely going to, take that information from somebody they know and have been working with much easier than, a government official or, even somebody like me. So I really appreciate that you guys are taking this on, because I think that this is such important work, and hopefully you talking with them is going to make them feel more comfortable. So I think the final piece too that I'll just add with the safety and kind of thoughts around that is that ultimately families may be willing to take a risk if they really believe that the benefit for their community and for their family is going to be, positive in the long run. And so we certainly know that this count is going to help communities strengthen their schools, their hospitals, other businesses use this census data. It's going to help know in terms of roads what work we need to do. So hopefully in the end there will be a belief that the help of this and doing this and taking a risk for this will end up being worth it for them and for their family. So clearly there's, places that folks can go on like the census website to get more information and to ask questions, and the phone number will be available to call in. But we also know that many people won't necessarily want to talk to somebody from the government about this. And so I will share that NALEO, which is the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, they are doing a lot of census outreach work, particularly for the Latino population, but it extends beyond that. And one thing that they will have is they're having a bilingual census information hotline, which will be in English, will be in Spanish. They also have a website that's both in English and in Spanish, and the opportunity to text as well. And really, they will be, as this all starts rolling out, they're going to be collecting kind of, questions from folks. And this weird thing happened. Was that really a census worker? Or, how do I know that this worked out in the way that it was supposed to? They will absolutely take those. So I think this is kind of a separate organization that can be trusted. And if folks have concerns or seeing things happening that are concerning, I think this is a good, safe place that they can answer those questions. So I want to talk through, for home visitors, really what the do's and the don'ts are for census education, because there's certainly a lot that we can do around this in terms of outreach, and then there's absolutely things that we can't be doing, and so want folks to make sure that they're aware of that. So certainly home visitors can educate their families about the importance of completing the census. That is absolutely something that we can go out and do, and hopefully we're helping in making home visitors more experts around the census and that they can share information with their families. The other thing that they can absolutely do is encourage families to complete their census form online, by phone, by mail, all of those things they can do. I think another thing that certainly home visitors can do is really process with families and reason through kind of tough situations or challenges and figuring out where kids should be counted. Certainly if their kids are living in a complex living situation, that could be something they could talk through with their home visitor on trying to figure out where that child should be counted. And also just processing too that we absolutely know that these may be kind of, if there is any conflict in relationships, perhaps between parents or caregivers, kind of talking through ways to either approach that conversation or make it so that, it's going to work well for that family. And certainly home visitors know those families and can just kind of help whoever the caregiver is that they're working with kind of process that and figure out what the best option is. Along with that, home visitors can help families use the internet. They can log into the census website and show them where to go to fill out their census form. If you have computers or tablets that are available for use, you can absolutely provide those devices to families to be able to use, whether it's kind of in your office during a group connection, or if you have something that you can use in the field. Those are definitely things that we can use. And then definitely for either English or non-English speaking respondents or folks that need more help, they can help them call the census phone line and help figure out how to get them to the right language, to speak with the right person. All of that is absolutely stuff that they can do in this work. So in terms of what home visitors can't do, no one other than census employees can actually collect census responses and turn them into the Census Bureau. So it's not like we could print a bunch of the draft census forms and have them fill it out in a group connection and then we go find a census worker and turn it in. Absolutely cannot do that. Additionally, home visitors can't fill out the census form for a family. This needs to be something that whoever that person that's been identified in the household that's going to fill this out, they need to be the ones that are actually filling it out. Certainly, I think questions come up with people with disabilities or perhaps with challenges in literacy or reading. I think oftentimes the phone may be a better solution than folks kind of trying to fill out a form for a family. Ultimately, they really need to be the ones that are providing the responses and filling it out. In addition to that, we can't have anybody responding to the census on behalf of a household that they're not part of. So I think an example of this is it would be illegal to fill out a census response for your neighbor's house, even though you know that they didn't respond and you're trying to get whoever lives there counted. That is definitely not okay and illegal. So I wanted to walk through with you guys just some common questions that have come up and some potential answers to those. So the first one is one that we spoke about, but I heard there's a citizenship question on the form. I don't want to share that information with the government. Well, we know that the Supreme Court ruled that the census cannot include a citizenship question, and could respond. I've got a copy of the questions if you want to see them. You can skip questions if you don't feel comfortable answering them. Just know that someone from the census may follow up with you if you don't answer a question on the form. So I think that is a potential way to answer that question. So it's certainly possible that a family could say, we've got more people living in our apartment than are on our lease. Will the census people let my landlord know? Absolutely not. Census workers can't share your information with anyone, not your landlord, and not even with other parts of the government that are outside of the Census Bureau. We know that workers take a lifetime oath to protect your personal information with pretty strict penalties, including a fine of up to $250,000 and up to 5 years in jail. So census workers really know that the biggest part of their job is making sure that they keep that information private. So another question that may come up is, why does the government need to do this? Can't they get this information in other ways? Well, I think the first piece of that is that the census count is required by our Constitution, and the writers of the Constitution wanted to make sure that resources and also political representatives were distributed fairly across the country. And so that's why this was written into our Constitution. And really in thinking about, getting more information, we certainly know that Colorado's changed a lot in the past 10 years. A lot of people have moved here. And we really, as a group, want to make sure that Colorado gets its fair share of federal resources so that we have the necessary things that we need for our communities and for the people that are living here. And finally, another common question that I think could potentially come up is, what happens if I just don't fill it out? I'm just not going to do it. I think families need to know and understand that people working for the census are really going to try their best to count every person living in the U.S. because that's really the goal that they've been charged with. And so for families, they really do need to know that if your address does not respond by the end of April, there will be a person from the census that's going to come and is going to try and help you complete the form in person. So if they don't want somebody coming to their home, really the best thing to do would be to complete it online or by phone before the end of April. We are going to start to think through together kind of what a message could be that home visitors kind of share with their families. And I think these are kind of the main components that we want to work on making sure are answered. Absolutely, what is the census? When should they expect information about it? How should they expect to get it? Why is the government collecting this information from them in the first place? And how is it kept safe? So we're going to work shortly on, figuring out ways that might feel comfortable to share that with families. But if I was going to do this with families today, I think likely what I would share with them is, you end up finishing up a visit, got about 5 minutes left, about ready to walk out the door, and could say to a family, have you heard about the census? This is something that the U.S. does every 10 years to count every person living in the U.S. And they do this to determine how to distribute funding and resources to where people are living in all parts of the country. Census Day is April 1st of this year, and each address or house or apartment is going to be receiving a letter about how to participate in the census in mid-March. Most other countries, like Mexico, also do a similar type of count every 10 years. And the census is going to ask one person at each address to go online and fill out a form, or they can also do this by telephone. It's going to ask questions about how many people are living at that address. And we know that in the past, families have commonly left off babies and young children and not included them on their census form. And so one thing we're really working on is making sure that babies and kids get counted this year. This is really important because funding for schools and other family services is determined by how many people are believed to be living in a certain community. I want to let you know that your information will be kept safe. Additionally, I also want to mention to you that there's been a lot of talk about a citizenship question being included on the census this year, but the Supreme Court ruled that it couldn't be included, so it's definitely not on there. What questions do you have for me about the census? And then I think along with that, somebody could say something like, you know, we plan to have a group meeting or a group connection in March or April to talk about the census as a group. And we also plan to have computers available there. So you could fill out your census form online with us there if you like. So, you know, I think that's kind of an example of, you know, what somebody could say to a family around the census. And again, I think those important messages to deliver and really the reason why we do this is that counting your children in the census means that local schools are definitely going to get more resources within your community. It's going to help your local government plan for the future. So any needs for schools, hospitals, roads, childcare, all of those things, it's going to be using those numbers to count and figure out really how many of those resources we need. And then in addition to that, I think this idea of, you know, what is important regarding counting kids. And so with the census only happening once every 10 years, you know, if a 2-year-old is not counted, our community really is going to miss them in terms of calculations for education, childcare, healthcare, really for 10 years, which is a good portion and most of their childhood. So we really don't want them to be missed, and we want to make sure that they get counted. So I'm going to stop at that point, and I'd love to hear, I'm going to the chat too, so I'm seeing some questions, and I will absolutely answer those. And if there's other questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or we are a small enough group, so please unmute yourself if you like. So the question is there a code for each household, or can families log on and begin completing the census anytime? So yes, there will be a code that will come on the letter and that invitation that is mailed to the household. That doesn't mean that anybody needs that code, however, to complete the census. So certainly if families do not have that code, they can input what I'm perceiving to be like their address, and then they'll be able to respond to the census in that way. I think the big thing about the code, in a way, this is making things easier for the Census Bureau because they've, you know, matched these codes with all of these addresses. So I think it's making things simpler for them, facilitating things for them, but is not required. You don't need a code to participate. Similarly, like folks that are perhaps like truly homeless and not like living in somebody else's house for a short period of time, and so then really they should be counted in that house. But if they are truly homeless, my understanding is there will be an option to even put in intersections. So you could say like, I'm living right now at the intersection of like, you know, Colfax and York in Denver, and could fill out a census that way. So hopefully that answers that question. All right, well, feel free to use the chat or certainly unmute yourselves if there's anything else that comes up in terms of questions. So I'd love to take an opportunity for folks to practice a little bit. So I would like everybody to just take about 5 minutes to think about, in terms of the messaging and all of that, what would you personally feel comfortable or want to share with your families in trying to encourage them to participate in the census? So we'll just take about 3 to 5 minutes here to really think through that on our own, okay? All right. Just so you guys know, there's only 5 of you on the phone today. I wonder if anybody's willing to kind of share it all, what they thought about, and you know, what they would consider kind of sharing with the family if they were having that conversation.
Hey, Laura, can you hear us?
I can, yay, awesome.
So I'm here with Lauren, one of my parent educators. And
hi, Lauren.
We had a discussion that this feels like some of the information we share with families, right? It's not really, we wouldn't present it in really a different way. We would ask, you know, have you heard about the census? Do you have any questions? We were appreciating all the information because it's very simple to explain it with the information that you've given us, especially the information around children, the importance of children being counted, and how if they're not counted, it does affect their life for the next 10 years. I hadn't thought of it that way. So to me, that was very powerful.
Okay, well, good. Well, one of the things that we have done in kind of the in-person trainings that a number of folks have been able to participate in is really just kind of practicing talking about the census and really practicing what you would share. So certainly I think that, you know, if you have any opportunities, you know, you could do that in another meeting and just have an opportunity to really think through what's important to you, what makes sense, and what you could share with the family. So moving on, I've got a number of scenarios that are things that are, you know, potential questions or things that could happen in terms of a family that may come up, and would just love it if folks either in the chat or in, certainly if you want to unmute yourselves, want to share about what you would think about and kind of what you would do. And we can have just a brief discussion here on what we would say to a family. So in the first scenario, we're pretending that you're on a home visit and you shared kind of your basic information with families about the census. And then we know that kind of a mom and her son are living with her neighbor after they moved out of her parents' home due to significant conflict with her parents. She says she's not sure if her neighbor filled out the census form and if her family was counted. What would you do in that situation? Any thoughts around this scenario and what you might do? So I, you know, would really talk with mom to see, you know, first, has she checked in with the neighbor? Has she even asked? Is this something she's nervous about doing? Is there a way to coach her on figuring out how to ask the neighbor? And certainly figure out in the first place if she was counted or not on the form. I think if she wasn't counted, but the neighbor already filled out the form, what I might do is have her call the actual census number and talk with somebody there to figure out what their thoughts are and what they should do. So that's what I would do in that situation. So you're on a home visit and shared information about the census with one of your families. And in this situation, they clearly listened to you, but still seem very fearful and are hesitant about completing the form. What would you do in this situation? So if this were me in this situation, likely what I would do is certainly make sure to talk through with the family about what they're scared of and what their fears are, first and foremost, so I can kind of direct how I would respond based on that. And certainly would be likely to stress the confidentiality pieces around the census and the safety, that really the privacy piece is so important, that the people that do this work take an oath, and that they really are in a place where they could be subject to some pretty major penalties around what could happen if they shared their information. And I think the final thing that I really would also stress is that really hoping that knowing what the good is from their information and what it could do for their community and so forth, and hopefully that knowledge that taking this risk is going to produce some good, perhaps will help them feel less fearful. Okay, so scenario 3. You're on a home visit and shared information about the census with one of your families, and they say, I don't think I'm going to do it. It's not going to matter that much if they miss us. What would you do for that one? All right, so if I was going to do this one, I would certainly say to them that we absolutely know that the census is really important, that the count that their community gets and the number of people living there is what's going to determine what happens with their schools, with their hospitals, with their roads, and that, you know, if a lot of people end up having that attitude, like certainly their community is not going to receive a lot of resources, which is really going to be unfortunate for their community. And I would say, you know, certainly along with that census workers really are going to try their best to get them to respond. And so if they would prefer to do it, you know, in an online format or on a phone call, rather than with a person in person, you know, we encourage them absolutely to do it in those ways. Because really the census workers' jobs are going to be to try and count every person. And so they absolutely think they are important and are going to try and count them and their families. All right. I'm going to do some wrap up now, but certainly if there's any more questions, feel free to unmute yourselves or type something into the chat. So one thing that I will be sending to everybody is that we, along with a couple of other folks at different sites, ended up creating a census group meeting or group connection template, and did this so that we kind of could provide you guys with something that might be helpful in figuring out how to lead one. Certainly, you guys don't have to do this. It is not required. It's only created out of this might help you not have to like do an actual meeting plan. And one thing that it does include, which I didn't play for you today, but there is a census song for kids called Everyone Counts. It's offered in both Spanish and English. And so this kind of group connection centers around that census song, which is fun and playful, and encourage you guys to check it out and see that. So that will be included in the materials that we give to you. In addition to that, we will be mailing or can provide to folks both coloring books in English and Spanish that are geared towards kids and getting all kids counted. And then we also have stickers that are related to, they say things like babies count and kids count. We have those in both Spanish and English. and certainly we'll provide you with stickers for your families so you can share those and hand those out. So kind of some fun things to use in your outreach. Beyond the video that I did share, I think there's a lot of public service announcements that the Census Bureau that have put together that are actually pretty good. And so I created a video list of ones that are even like 20 or 30 seconds. They can be quite short, that can be helpful and powerful if that is something that you want to share with families. As well as there are some longer videos. In particular, there's one on there in Spanish that is close to like 20 minutes long, so it's really long. But I think it's done in a way that's really helpful with myth busting, particularly for the Latino population, and may be helpful if there's families that are really struggling with kind of the safety pieces of the census. And then finally, I also included for you that there was an early childhood work group that did a census toolkit. And in addition to the materials that are within that, they have a lot of social media related pieces. And so if you are, doing a lot of social media, if that's something that feels good to your organization, you certainly don't have to, but there's some information in there about when and what types of things you could put on Facebook or tweeting related to the census. So certainly not a requirement, but if that's something that you'd like to do, that's certainly an option. Certainly feel free to contact me with any questions that come up in your visits. I'm absolutely willing to try and troubleshoot with folks about questions that come up, and I may not know the answer, but certainly have gotten connected to some people that are doing census work, and I'm happy to connect you with those folks. And then I will post a recording of this webinar along with all of those electronic copies of the materials that we shared, as well as the PowerPoint presentation. So certainly you can have access to all of these things. So any last questions at all? There is a question. So prenatal children counted. So Sharon, that's a really good question. Certainly if somebody is pregnant during the census time period, so like March and April, and they likely don't have a baby until May, June, July, my sense is that if the baby was born before April 1st or on April 1st, that would be a baby that would be counted. However, what we have been telling families is that the way that you fill out the form is you put a birth date on there. And so I would just encourage families to include on their forms any people from any time when the census is being collected that is in that household. And if that's a day-old baby, put the baby down on the form. So then ultimately with that birth date there, it doesn't end up being like our decision about whether or not that baby should be counted. It's going to end up being the statisticians and the data nerds on the back end that decide this was our cutoff of when folks are included or not included. But then it kind of takes away from us that we don't have to make that decision. But ultimately, yes, a baby would need to be born to be counted.
Hi, sorry, this is Colleen. I just wanted to tag on to that just the last topic about the prenatal. So would you, or would any of us recommend to a family that does have a baby due for them to hold off and wait longer?
You know, I guess I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. I mean, I think if they're due in end of March, maybe waiting slightly might make sense, but I guess in the end, a new baby is also going to create all sorts of chaos, and I guess in the end, it's probably better for a form to get filled out with, mom and her 2 kids, and the 3 of them rather than nobody. So I guess I wouldn't necessarily give that advice. I don't know how much we want to play the system. I think we just definitely want to make sure that for babies that are born, that they are counted. I guess that's kind of my thought process on that.
Great, thanks.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for joining today. Certainly let me know if anything comes up, and I will do my best in getting materials out to you guys super soon so you have all of that.